When we think of the 1970s, many of us imagine people dancing in discos, unique fashion with bold colors and bell-bottoms, and advancements in technology. But that decade is also remembered for some disturbing events that took place, many of which made headlines around the world. Number 10. Bruce Lee will forever be considered one of the greatest martial artists to ever live. While he was born in San Francisco, he spent most of his childhood growing up in Hong Kong, where his father worked as an actor and opera singer. This led directly to Lee's interest in the entertainment industry, and soon he was cast in several movies, usually as a troubled youth. In his teenage years, he started practicing martial arts and took dancing lessons, but since he'd started affiliating with street gangs, he often got into trouble with the law. When this caused his parents to start fearing for his safety, they decided to send him to the US, where he stayed with family friends in Seattle. After graduating from high school, he attended the University of Washington, where he studied drama and philosophy, and soon he rented a space where he opened a martial arts school. He then developed a unique form of martial arts called Jeet Kune Do, and after demonstrating this at a karate tournament in Los Angeles, he landed his first movie role when he was spotted by a TV producer. Hence, he appeared in the TV show The Green Hornet, in which he played the part of the character Kato. But the show proved to be unpopular with audiences, and it was canceled. HW continued to teach classes and looked for more acting work, but after growing frustrated at the lack of offers, he moved back to Hong Kong. This proved to be a good idea, as he soon became a well-known actor not only there, but in the US. This allowed him to start a career as a director, and he founded a production company. He starred in his own films and soon became a global movie star. The first of these films was called Return of the Dragon, still considered to be one of the greatest martial arts films of all time, and the second was titled Enter the Dragon, which would go on to be another massive success. But Lee would never know this since he passed away 6 days before its release. The official cause of his passing in 1973, at the age of 32, was reported as swelling of his brain, thanks to an allergic reaction that he had to headache medication that he had taken. But many other sources reported that he passed away under mysterious circumstances, and since then, many theories have been suggested as to what really happened that day. On the 20th of July that year, Lee had visited actress Betty Ting Pei at her home in Hong Kong, and according to reports, he and Pei spent a long while alone. He then rehearsed some of his scenes from the film Game of Death, which he directed and was slated to star in. He finished his rehearsals at around 7:30 p.m., and after drinking some water, started complaining about dizziness and a headache. Pei gave him a headache tablet, which he then ingested before retiring to his bedroom. Pei would contact a doctor 2 hours later when she was unable to wake him up, but the doctor was unable to resuscitate Lee, who sadly lost his life after being transferred to a local hospital. An autopsy revealed that his brain was a half-pound heavier than it should have been, and soon conspiracies started to emerge. Some people believed that he was assassinated by the Triad Gang, or that he had drunk too much water after suffering from a heat stroke. But a paper published in 2022 suggests that Lee was suffering from a type of kidney dysfunction, and that his body was unable to excrete water efficiently. It's believed that this caused the sodium levels in his body to drop, which then resulted in a cerebral edema, which is the accumulation of fluid on the brain, which then rendered him unconscious and ultimately claimed his life. This diagnosis remains just a theory, and many people are still convinced that Lee's passing occurred under suspicious circumstances. Number 9. Spiro Agnew, who became the United States' 39th vice president, became only the second person ever to resign from this post, thanks to a scandal in which he was accused of bribery, tax fraud, and extortion. He was nominated for the role of vice president, and thanks to his speeches against the Vietnam War, protests, as well as his colorful quips, he soon became the frontrunner and eventually the victor. But politicians in Baltimore County had a bad reputation by this point, and in 1974, the U.S. Attorney's Office started a corruption investigation. The issue started in 1963, when A. Gordon Boone was found guilty of committing mail fraud and later in that decade, it was discovered that several contractors were involved in a payoff scheme. The problem worsened in 1972, when Senator Daniel Brewster was exposed for accepting a bribe. The first two people to be investigated were Marvin Mandel and Dale Anderson, and at the time, the Department of Justice was told that Agnew would not be part of the probe. It was discovered that several Baltimore County employees had been receiving kickbacks from public contractors, which saw them receive as much as 5% of the value of any given job in exchange for these contracts being handed to them. The bribes were paid to these officials and were listed by these companies as employee bonuses, and hence went undetected for quite some time. When these accusations came to light, many of these contracting companies started cooperating with the investigation under threat of prosecution. That was when it was discovered that Agnew was also involved in several spurious transactions. It was revealed that while he was serving as a Baltimore County executive, governor, and vice president, he'd started taking bribes, some of which were considerable. It then came to light that he considered his salary while serving in these positions to be too low, and that he should be able to present himself as wealthy. To achieve this, he started supplementing his income with those bribes. Witnesses would later report that he would often receive money in envelopes marked papers or information. These were actually kickbacks from contractors, and it was soon discovered that he'd been sharing these kickbacks with two of his friends. On one occasion, Agnew received an envelope containing $10,000 from a contractor as a thanks for being awarded a certain job. It was also discovered that he'd been receiving state bond issues from a financial institution and bribes from consulting engineers. When the then president, Richard Nixon, was told of the allegations against Agnew, he demanded an explanation, and on two separate occasions, he asked Agnew to resign from his position. But he refused to do so, and also caused problems in the ensuing investigation when he refused to cooperate. According to many sources, he was certain that he would never be indicted. Nixon, though, was determined to prevent Agnew from becoming the next president, and so the pair entered into a plea deal that would see Agnew avoid prison time. He was told that the investigation uncovered his tax fraud to the tune of $13,000, and that he'd received over $100,000 in kickbacks and bribes. Faced with these allegations, he decided to accept the plea deal, and he resigned from his post, but always maintained that he was innocent of the charges against him. Number 8. The world of politics is convoluted at the best of times, as is evidenced by the fact that while ex-Vice President Agnew was being investigated for bribery and tax evasion during the 70s, then President Richard Nixon also fell under the spotlight of the law. The incident, which is known as the Watergate scandal, would ultimately lead to Nixon's downfall, and at the time, it was seen as one of the biggest political scandals the country had ever seen. It all started on the 17th of June, 1972, when a group of 5 individuals was taken into custody after it was discovered they'd broken into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, which was situated in Washington's Watergate office complex. While the men were in the process of committing the crime, a search guard at the complex noticed that something was wrong, and he contacted the police. Upon their arrival, the 5 burglars were caught red-handed with around $3,500 in cash, as well as electronic and surveillance equipment that was worth a lot of money. While they were in prison awaiting trial, the FBI became involved, and 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started suggesting that Nixon was involved somehow. They believed that burglary was connected to his re-election campaign, but Nixon and the White House trashed these claims, and in 1972, Nixon was re-elected as president. The trial started in January of the next year, but weeks later, the judge overseeing the matter stated that he felt as though some information was being withheld. The burglars all pleaded guilty, and they were sentenced on the 23rd of March that year, each receiving a sentence of between 2 and 8 years in prison, though they ended up serving less. One of the burglars then did something most unexpected. James McCord charged the White House with trying to cover up its involvement in the crime, leading to several politicians resigning from their posts. Nixon then announced that a deeper investigation would be started. White House counsel John Dean stated at a hearing that Nixon was involved in covering up the burglary, but added that he had no evidence to support his claims. In July of that year, though, Alexander Butterfield revealed the existence of 9 secret audio recordings in which Nixon could be heard discussing the cover-up. It seemed like a simple matter to resolve. All that needed to be done was for Nixon to hand over the recordings so that they could be analyzed, but he refused to do so. This resulted in another slew of resignations, and eventually Nixon released 7 of the recordings. One tape, though, was found to have been tampered with, as some of the audio was inexplicably missing. Thanks to these tapes, it was soon revealed that the White House had organized the burglary, and it was involved in many other unethical activities, including the harassment of political rivals with the aid of the IRS. Number 7. In April of 1975, it had become apparent that the end of the Vietnam War was finally at hand, and that it would likely occur in the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, as North Vietnamese forces were fast approaching. By the middle of April, Saigon was surrounded on all sides by North Vietnamese soldiers, and since most of the American soldiers had already been evacuated, millions of people were left stranded. As news of this started to spread among the public, tens of thousands of people started to evacuate the city, but it wasn't civilians who decided to flee. Soldiers gathered their families before leaving the city, as did government officials who realized that the country would revert to a communist state following an unconditional surrender, and that they'd likely be prosecuted for their roles in the war. While this was happening, most American civilians and soldiers were evacuated, and the US military started aiding those who decided to flee. Helicopters were used to remove them from the country, but since only a limited number was available, the situation grew ever more desperate. Some Vietnamese soldiers abandoned their uniforms to blend in with civilians in hopes that they would be allowed onto the aircraft, while some people started climbing the walls of the American embassy, hoping they'd be allowed onto the next helicopter to leave. Aircraft carriers that were stationed off the coast were used to house these refugees, and when rooms started to run out, American soldiers started pushing helicopters into the ocean to clear the decks for others that were incoming. This evacuation was codenamed Operation Frequent Wind, and throughout, people could be seen clinging to helicopters as they took off, and crowding onto rooftops in hopes of being noticed. But the operation was delayed thanks to US Ambassador Graham Martin's denial that such evacuations were necessary. The US military was ultimately able to evacuate about 7,000 soldiers and civilians, but that number would have been much higher were it not for Martin's delay. In the end, tens of thousands of people were left stranded when the US military personnel were evacuated from the US Embassy on the 30th of April that year. While many people were grateful that the war was finally over, and that they'd finally see the return of their loved ones, matters were very different in Vietnam. The fall of Saigon was seen as a failure on the part of the American military, since they were unable to protect the citizens of South Vietnam as we had hoped. Number 6. A blackout that occurred in New York in 1977 led to some disturbing behavior on the part of the city's residents, and many historians consider it to be one of the worst disasters New York has ever had to deal with. The blackout wasn't caused by human error or incompetence, but on this occasion by nature. On the 13th of July that year, a storm had broken out in Westchester County, and at around 8:30 p.m., a series of lightning strikes hit the Buchanan South substation on the Hudson River. This caused circuit breakers to fail, and the main lines into the city became overloaded. But this was just the first of 2 lightning strikes, as the second hit a Yonkers substation, and 2 more main lines went down. Workers did their best to reduce the load, but to no avail, and an hour later, a large portion of New York was shrouded in darkness when its largest power generator failed. The only area that was left unaffected was Queens, which was powered by a company on Long Island. In most parts of the world, whenever a blackout occurs, people simply wait for the issue to be resolved before they carry on with their daily lives. But for some reason, the residents of New York saw this as an opportunity, and they took to the streets. Many were left frustrated as the subways had shut down, and they couldn't travel anywhere. At Shea Stadium, a baseball game between the New York Mets and Chicago Cubs had to be halted in the 6th inning, and all the banks in the area were closed. One major concern was that hospitals in the area had no power, and generators were immediately sent out to these facilities after a state of emergency was declared. Police officers and firefighters were sent into the city to try and keep order, and then the finger-pointing started. The then mayor of New York, Ed Beam, immediately blamed Con Ed for the power failure, as he believed the blackout was the result of negligence on their part, but the worst was yet to come. Since most businesses had closed for the day, stores were left unattended, and before long, residents poured into the streets, resulting in widespread looting. Not even stores that were secured with metal shutters were safe from the mayhem, as these shutters were torn down before the windows were smashed, and people started stealing anything they could get their hands on. Groups of men could be seen throwing bricks and other items through storefront windows before running into stores and emerging with televisions, clothes, jewelry, and liquor. Some brandished tire irons and crowbars as they entered pharmacies to steal medication, and supermarkets were flooded with looters who stole as much food as they could. Over the course of about 25 hours, $300 million had been done to the city by its own citizens, and the world was left dumbstruck when it was reported on the news. Some businesses had to close down for good, since the damage was too extensive and expensive to repair. Number 5. The Vietnam War remains one of the more vivid memories among those who lived in the US at the time. As with any war, some supported it and others stood firmly against it, and thanks to this, a historical event known as the Hard Hat Riots took place. Students would hold regular protests against the war, and on some occasions, they were held in cities across the US at the same time. During one demonstration that was held in Kent, Ohio, the Ohio National Guard responded, and unfortunately, when the protests turned violent, they ended the lives of 4 people. This only further strengthened the position of those who stood against the war, and the following day, more than 1,000 students in New York City gathered at the United Nations in protest. The flag at City Hall was flown at half-mast in honor of the students who lost their lives, but this did little to stem the anger and frustration of the protesters. Many people agreed with their stance on the war, but the same could not be said for those who'd fought in Vietnam and who had experienced the horrors of the war firsthand. On the 6th of May, the protesters were confronted by a group of construction workers, most of whom were Vietnam veterans. Confrontation didn't escalate, but 2 days later, the situation deteriorated dramatically. On the 6th of May, hundreds of students gathered in Manhattan, and the group started marching towards Federal Hall. Once they arrived, they gathered in front of the statue of George Washington and started shouting anti-war slogans. The peaceful nature of the protest wouldn't last long, though, as a group of about 200 construction workers decided they'd had enough of the protests, and they also arrived at the hall, bearing pro-war signs and shouting slogans such as "All the Way USA" and "Love It or Leave It." Despite police presence, the workers managed to barge through, and they started attacking what they described as typical hippie students, who they believed knew nothing about the war and who they felt had no right to stand against it. The students tried to fight back, but soon found themselves overwhelmed, and when the fight finally came to an end, around 70 people suffered injuries. But the workers didn't stop there. Once they were done with the students, they marched to City Hall, where they held up their pro-war signs and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. They also demanded that the flags be raised back up to full mast, and in an effort to bring the chaos to an end, this was done. Some people started speculating that the construction workers had been egged on by their unions, but this was later proven inaccurate. They'd merely decided to stand up against the students and did so of their own volition. Number 4. Whenever nuclear accidents are discussed, the disaster at the Chernobyl plant in Russia is the first to come to mind. But some people forget that the US was once the site of a nuclear meltdown that took place in 1978. Early in the morning of the 28th of March that year, a pressure valve at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, failed. The valve was part of the number 2 reactor at the plant, and it would later be determined that it failed to close when it should have. It was supposed to keep water inside the nuclear core, and when it failed, the much-needed water started to drain out of the core, and temperatures started to rise rapidly. What followed was a scene of chaos inside the plant as workers scrambled to find the cause and corrective action to take. It's said that a lot of misinformation was relayed between the employees, and at some point the order was given to shut down the reactor's emergency water system. This proved to be a costly mistake, since the water would have reduced temperatures in the core, but the situation only escalated from there. One plant employee would later recall that sirens started sounding, and the main control console was alight with flashing lights of different colors. Soon, the core became exposed, and as a result, its temperature rose even higher to around 4,300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it started to cook. Many workers started to fear that a nuclear meltdown was inevitable, while others remained adamant that the core was still covered and there was no imminent danger. They were certain that backup safety systems would take care of the issue, but this was not the case. The true gravity of the situation only became clear when a technician realized that contaminated water had started flowing into one of the adjacent buildings, and as a result, radioactive gases started leaking into the plant. News of the accident soon reached the media, and they reported that the situation was under control and there was no need for the public to be concerned. These reports came from the owners of the plant, Metropolitan Edison, but the truth then came to light. As the truth started to emerge, pregnant women and children were advised to evacuate the area. In response, 140,000 people decided to evacuate in case a true disaster was about to unfold. It was then discovered that a hydrogen bubble had formed over the core, and there were fears that it would explode. People could be seen praying in churches and in the streets, while others contemplated whether they should flee the area. But later that day, it was determined that the core had started to stabilize, and that the hydrogen bubble would not pose any further threat. This information was released to the public, and slowly the panic in the streets started to dissipate. 3 years later, it would be discovered that half of the core at reactor number 2 had melted away. The crisis was finally over, and there's no doubt that if the correct steps had not been taken, the accident would have escalated into a disaster, much like the Chernobyl incident that would occur less than a decade later. Number 3. In February of 1978, a fraudster named Melvin Weinberg was taken into custody when he was found to be involved in a real estate scam. The FBI saw this as an opportunity since he was known to also be an informant, and in exchange for his cooperation, they offered him a deal that would see his sentence reduced from 3 years to probation. Weinstein had previously helped the FBI during an investigation into stolen artwork, but this time, his role would be far more serious. The FBI was investigating white-collar crimes, and Weinberg had paid a set amount every month in exchange for information. He was told to disguise himself as the U.S. representative for a company called Abdul Enterprises, which in reality didn't exist. An FBI agent posed as an Arab sheikh called Kambir Abdul Rahman, while others assumed the roles of his entourage, and before long, they made contact with well-known businessmen, white-collar criminals, and fraudsters. They were told that the sheikh was a very wealthy man and that he'd acquired his wealth through oil. The operation was proceeding well, but in December of that year, it escalated dramatically when Weinberg and the mayor of Camden in New Jersey, Angelo Ericetti, met for the first time. Weinberg told him that Abdul Enterprises was looking to obtain a gambling license for a casino, and Ericetti responded by telling him that the license could be secured fraudulently for a fee of $400,000. Weinberg pretended to be delighted by the offer and also managed to secure a list of names from the mayor of other politicians and businessmen who were willing to commit fraud for the right price. The focus of the operation shifted towards corrupt politicians, and over the course of the next 12 months, the FBI arranged for Weinberg to meet with people on the list, most of whom were Democrats. The first to be implicated were U.S. Representatives Raymond Lederer and Michael Myers, who assured him that they would hasten his application for immigration into the U.S. for a certain amount of money. Next, Senator Harrison Williams Jr. promised to do the same for another fictional sheikh called Yasir Habib, but only if the sheikh agreed to invest millions of dollars into a titanium mine, in which Williams held a financial interest. The operation had started picking up steam when someone informed the press of its existence, but it continued, and several more people were arrested. 19 politicians were convicted of fraud, accepting bribes and extortion, as well as conspiracy. Williams decided to resign from his post before he could be fired, and in the aftermath, 2 more representatives resigned, and 3 failed to be re-elected. But Myers was expelled from his post. George X. Schwartz, Harry P. Gennady, and Louis C. Johansson were convicted after it was proven they'd accepted $65,000 in bribes, while unknowingly being recorded during a series of meetings that took place at a Barclay Hotel in Philadelphia. As a result, a new set of guidelines was released to the FBI in 1981 in order to prevent further damage to the U.S. legislative branch's reputation, while the agency was conducting similar operations in the future. Number 2. Earthquakes are a terrifying natural occurrence that can cause massive amounts of damage in mere minutes, and the quake that occurred in Tangshan, China in 1976 was no exception. At the time, Tangshan was an industrial city housing more than 1 million people, none of whom were any the wiser to the disaster that was about to occur early in the morning of the 28th of July that year. At around 3:42 a.m., a quake measuring between 7.8 and 8.2 on the Richter scale struck while most people were still sound asleep in their beds. It would later come to light that in the days before the earthquake struck, people had started noticing a few strange events in the city. They would see water levels first rise and then inexplicably drop again, and many reported seeing colonies of rats running through the streets as if they were fleeing from something unseen. Farmers reported that their animals refused to feed, and in the hours before the disaster, some residents had witnessed strange flashes of light and fireballs that seemed to have no origin. When the quake finally struck, it was devastating. Since most of the city's residents were asleep in their houses, they were caught off guard, unable to make it outside before their houses collapsed. Some of those who survived the collapses managed to crawl to safety despite their injuries, and since temperatures were high at the time, most were unclothed. Since the quake hit an industrial area, many factories were badly damaged, and this resulted in several fires breaking out. In some areas, poisonous gas was released into the air, and people were forced to flee for their lives, leaving their ruined homes behind. Thousands of people were left without water and electricity, and the roads, as well as railways, were inaccessible. The disaster took the Chinese government by complete surprise, and aid was only dispatched the following day, more than 24 hours after the quake struck. Planes and helicopters were sent to Tangshan to drop food, water, and medical supplies, and 100,000 soldiers were dispatched to aid with rescue and recovery operations. But even this was an issue, since they couldn't travel to the city using the roads or railways. The soldiers had to march 180 miles from Jinshu to Tangshan, but their eventual arrival was seen as a blessing. More than 30,000 medical personnel and 30,000 construction workers were sent to the area to aid those in need, but even those numbers were found to be lacking. It would later be revealed that the Chinese government had refused to accept aid from foreign countries, since it considered itself to be self-sufficient. Most of the city had been completely flattened, and when it was eventually rebuilt, buildings were erected with new earthquake precautions, ensuring that damage would be kept to a minimum if another massive earthquake was to hit the city in the years to come. Number 1. The 1970s weren't just known for political turmoil and natural disasters. Many people have since noticed that during that decade, cases involving serial killers started to rise, one of whom was David Berkowitz, also known as Son of Sam. Berkowitz originally hailed from Brooklyn in New York. He was born after his father and mother, Betty Falco and Joseph Kleinman, both of whom were married to other people, had an affair. And after he was born, he was put up for adoption. He was adopted by Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz, who were living in the Bronx at the time. Pearl was unable to have children, and so they decided to adopt a child of their own. But they soon discovered that Berkowitz was a handful, since he hated going to school despite being very smart, and started exhibiting hyperactivity. Furthermore, he always seemed to be in a bad mood, and before long he started acting out by stealing, setting fires, and bullying other children. But despite setting more than 1,000 fires, a claim of his own that was never verified, he was never caught. When he turned 5, Pearl and Nathan revealed that he was adopted, and his thoughts started to turn darker when he was told that Betty had lost her life during childbirth. This left him feeling responsible for his mother's passing, and it had a severe effect on him. He started to fear that his biological father would come looking for him to take revenge, and before long, he found himself feeling isolated. To curtail this, he joined the military, but found this boring since he wanted to fight in Vietnam, but was instead sent to South Korea. After his service ended, he felt lonelier than ever. He started looking into his family's history, and this revealed that his biological mother was actually still alive. He and his mother and sister reunited, but when he learned that his birth was the result of an extramarital affair, he broke off all contact. He started working as a letter sorter at a post office, but became ever more enraged by the fact that his adopted parents had lied to him, and the fact that his biological parents had abandoned him. When he turned 21, he became interested in Satanism, and he grew ever more paranoid. Soon, he could no longer make a distinction between reality and fantasy, and he believed he'd been possessed by demons. On the 24th of December, 1975, he claimed his first victims when he used a sharpened blade to attack 2 women. But one of the victims survived, and it was never confirmed that there was a second. Berkowitz then moved to Yonkers, and the following year, his true spree started. On the 29th of July that year, he ended the life of 18-year-old Donna Lauria and injured 19-year-old Jody Valenti. He would then start targeting couples who were sitting in parked cars, along with women who had long dark hair. He abandoned the use of a blade and instead used a firearm to carry out his crimes, leading to panic in the area and a massive manhunt by the police. He started writing to the police and media outlets under the pseudonym Son of Sam, in which he revealed that he was carrying out the devil's work. He would eventually be tracked down and was arrested in front of his apartment, and investigators stated he never even put up a fight. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.